Welcome! This video is brought to you by the Freethinker Institute. The week's subject, How to End the War Between Science and Religion or Spirituality, is hosted by Garrett, the Executive Director of the Freethinker Institute. To join these events, you can find us on Discord and on Meetup. The links can be found in the description.
Yeah. So with that said, let me pull up the presentation. So tonight's lecture, and we're going to go ahead and get started, is about ending the war between science and really what I generally term non-science. But when I say non-science, what I mean is religion and spirituality and any other beliefs which may be inconsistent at times. And so that's what I mean by religion and spirituality is any belief system that might have an inconsistency in it. And I will alternate between saying religion, spirituality, and non-science potentially throughout the remainder of the evening, because I kind of consider them more or less the same thing. I use them as synonyms. So just for defining, that's how I'm going to define it. And let me move that out of the way. And so agenda for the evening, we're going to talk about science and spirituality. We're going to define what I mean by science and spirituality. I think it's always good to start a discussion about definitions. We're going to talk about whether or not there really is a war going on. I had a few people write me and say, is there really a war between these two? And so I think it's important to address that. I think there is a war. Not all of us are in the war or on either side of the war. I'm actually like in the middle, trying to broker peace, and you'll see that by the end of the evening. I'm going to talk about something called Gridels' Incompleteness Serum, which I learned about in a 400 level computer science class. I will teach you all the sort of quick and dirty version of Gridels' Incompleteness Theorem because we don't have time for the full lecture that I got. And then I'm going to talk about the two types of truth that come out from Gridels' Incompleteness Theorem. And we'll talk a little bit about the root cause of the war and how to create peace. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Freethinker Institute, which is my not-for-profit, which is this event is basically I would sponsored by, there's no fees for any of us and no one's paying for me to lecture. So it's an egalitarian lecture brought to you by the Freethinker Institute. So not sponsored by. So yeah, that's basically kind of the agenda. And we might do a quick, if we have time, intro into the online community for the Freethinker Institute. I love for people to like engage between meetups in the online community and like have intellectually interesting conversations about whatever topic you guys are interested in, which is just a great way to stay in touch with other members, get to know each other better. I'm going to talk probably a little bit about the give and get spreadsheet that's in that community, which is about how we can help each other. We'll see if anything else comes out. I think that's the majority of it. So let's get started if people don't have questions. Like I said, feel free to interrupt me along the way. Totally fine with that. I would rather that than you wait and then the question is out of context. So first, let's talk about what science is. So science is, the way that I talk about it, I may be like, I didn't just pull up a dictionary definition, which you could all do very easily, and I'm sure you all know. Science is about repeatable experiments and, empiricism and learning from observation. And so those are all the things you're going to find from a typical definition. But for me, it's about, starting from axioms, which are things that we just assume to be true because they're so obviously true, and then creating rules of inference and conclusions, as well as repeatable deterministic process experiments. And really science is about creating a consistent knowledge base. Now, it's recognized that not all of science is consistent, right? Like science corrects itself all the time. That's one of the beauties of it, is when science finds that prior science is wrong, it will admit it's wrong, it will correct its error and say, here's the new, better version of the truth. And science is constantly seeking truth and looking for the new best version of the truth that it can find and support. Now, we'll talk about levels of confidence that scientific knowledge has in the discussion. But for definition's sake, hopefully that suffices. But basically, the thing that a lot of us respect about science and like about it is that it is intended to admit when it does and doesn't know an answer to a question, and be willing to say, we just don't know that yet, right? We're still researching it and we're trying to learn. And I'll argue that some of the reason that there's a war on science is sometimes science doesn't hold to those boundaries, and that'll be what we talk about. And I do talk about it right away. So science does have contradictions in the short term, like I mentioned, and the level of knowledge in science can be different. And so there.
Garrett?
Yeah, go ahead.
George has his hand raised.
Great, thank you, George. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking questions during the talk.
I love that. It's totally my favorite part of a talk is questions. So I really want to encourage questions. Like that's my favorite part. So please go ahead.
I just object. I think that ultimately the claim that, oh, there's not enough research and that'll be answered, I think that represents a dogma. So it's not a belief rooted in empiricism. It's just a dogma.
When you say it's a dogma, what do you mean by that?
It's just a belief that has no basis.
Which part?
Oh, that one day we haven't done enough research on it. We haven't been able to answer that question yet.
So I'm going to agree with you in this lecture. I'm going to completely agree with you. But I think that the idea, and I probably didn't phrase it cautiously enough, and this is why I write papers on the topics that I'm interested in, because I can refine the language to be more consistent. And what I mean by that is we may be able to answer it someday. And I think a lot of scientists will say we will answer it someday. And I think your objection to that is a very valid one. And what I'm going to try to make an argument for tonight is there are certain questions that science will never be able to answer. And so you're jumping ahead. But yeah, I agree with you. I'm going to try to make a logical case that we're accurate in that, and try to convince people of that logically rather than, like you said, you're criticizing that people have faith that they will come up with an answer. I'm going to try to, through logic, claim that they won't ever come up with an answer to certain questions.
The only thing I'll add is that it represents, I say dogma, but it's a faith.
Yeah,
it's a faith.
It is. And in fact, I have a paper on determinism, which explains why determinism requires more blind faith than medieval man had in omniscient and omnipotent God, which gets very controversial and is probably my least polite paper that I've ever written. But if anyone is interested in that, write me in the online community. I'll share it with you. I think I have a pretty good logical argument that's true. And when I realized that I was mind blown, that was true. But because I used to be a determinist atheist, so realizing that, was insightful. So thanks, George. Neville, did you have a question?
I think it's sort of, you're clarifying, in your discussion with George. So I think George was alluding to Quine's, in terms of his work on the dogma of empiricism. So I think, yes, I think what you're saying is sort of leading to clarity. But my question was simply that I think your number one was probably where it was created the confusion, because axioms, in some sense, axioms actually cover across both science and non-science fields.
Correct. And you can have axioms from a non-science field, but you can still use those axioms in science if people that believe science is the right paradigm agree with those axioms. Axioms have to be agreed upon by the people who are going to agree to the conclusions that the axioms are based on. So or that are following from those axioms. So, but you're right. So, and I don't mean to add confusion. I just want to say, science is, you can express things, and you're probably right that like traditional way of looking at science is more number two. The reason I include number one is because number one includes a lot of knowledge from a consistent knowledge-based perspective that will add to the body of science that may not even be observable through repeatable experiments, but it's just plain obvious, and so I want to include that knowledge because I'm really making a distinction, academically more between like what I would call consistent knowledge bases and inconsistent knowledge bases. Herb.
Yes, just wanted to point out that mathematics is not a science, but it can certainly, it doesn't spoil anything that's up there, because you said these include non-science things as well. So mathematics is not empirical, although it uses empirical information to get ideas about things. So I just wanted to point that out to the group.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
So when I say accepted science, so when I say science has different levels of confidence, right? There's like accepted science, which is like not really that subject to debate, which is like things like Earth is an oblate spheroid, like traveling through, around the sun. Like there are people who debate this, and there are people who disagree with it. 300,000 Americans think Earth is flat. I kid you not. But like, let's just at least agree that that's a highly unlikely to be wrong fact that science has come up with, that we're, Earth is an oblate spheroid. And then there are cutting edge sciences that, I read a paper probably about, I'm guessing 6 or 7 years ago, that said we will be able to teleport humans in 10 years. And this was because of quantum entanglement research. And it might have been 10 years ago, to be honest. It would be funnier if it was 10 years ago, because we're clearly not beaming up people by Scotty right now. So we're not there. And I don't think we're going to be there 10 years from now. I do have some thoughts on teleportation and how it might be theoretically possible, but it's all super theoretical and highly contestable. And I don't expect anyone to believe anything around those lines, and I don't fully believe anything around those lines. Now, there are things in the middle, and I'm going to make a controversial one, which is generally often considered accepted science, which is that the universe began at the Big Bang. And this is sort of a precursor for another talk that we'll have another night. And my question would be, well, what happened before the Big Bang, and how did the first moment in time come about if there was no time in the first place? And I would argue that, scientists don't have a great explanation for that, and I'll get more into that later in the talk. And again, that's controversial, I get that, but hopefully the two ends of the spectrum are clear, and we all know that there's stuff in the middle where science has different levels of certainty. And so as long as we know that, that's all that's important for the conversation. And by the way, I forgot to mention the format of the conversation. I'm going to talk for a while. We'll have questions along the way. After the talk, we'll have optional breakout sessions for anyone that wants to break out into small sessions. And then I'll stay with whoever wants to remain in the other group. And so we'll do that. I'll see if I can arrange for the breakout groups to work like that. And we'll just create optional breakout groups. I like to let people talk in small groups about stuff. I always like doing that. I like talking in small groups. I have introverted roots, so I enjoy small group conversations about a topic. So I want to give people the option to choose big group or small groups. And if everyone goes small group, then my group will be a small group too. So that said, let's, Herb, did you still have a question, or was your hand still up?
No, I forgot to take it down. I'm sorry.
No, so let's talk about what I call non-science, which is mostly spirituality and religion. And really when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about what I call inconsistent knowledge bases, where you may have two beliefs which conflict with each other, but both of them feel right. And so you're going to believe both, even though there may be some logical contradiction inherent between the two. Go ahead, Neville.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer this thought, because I am a philosopher of religion, in this field, and I think the point should be made that the whole concept of religion is contested, and in fact widely debated to a point that what philosophers tend to do is to use the term, but to really, in their mind, it's like, well, it's not really that. It's not this. It almost becomes a term of self-identification, which could take in a whole lot of a whole range of different ideas.
Right.
So Tim Fitzgerald and Russell McCutcheon has written quite a bit on this, on the concept of religion. And as far as spirituality, well, I haven't seen any philosopher that actually, has been brave enough to sort of deal with the concept of spirituality.
Cool. And I appreciate you mentioning that. I will say that's part of why I call part of why I call it non-science, because the real important concept is that these are what I'm addressing is any belief system which has inherent in it a logical contradiction. And so any belief system with a logical contradiction that exists in it is what I would call non-science. And I would say religion and spirituality, like, it's debatable, and you're saying it's all debatable in religion, and I agree with you. And like, even like what Christianity means, like, is very, like, for Christianity is super debated. That's why we have so many sects of Christianity. I'm not going to get into those complexities at all. All I'm going to say is there's, consistent knowledge bases, which I'm calling science, and inconsistent, for simplicity's sake, and inconsistent knowledge bases which have contradictions in them, which I'm calling non-science, which are generally aligned with religion and spirituality. So I hope that will become clear over time. If it's not, and you're still doubting things or asking, having questions in your mind, definitely ask, and feel free to now if you do. But basically the idea is that non-science, whereas science is generally intended to be able to be willing to say, we don't have a clear answer to that, non-science generally gives an answer to whatever question is asked. Generally, there's at least some guidance or direction, even if it's just pray to God and then see what happens, and whatever happens is what's meant to happen. It's at least an answer, right? And so it may not be an answer that you feel satisfied with, but it's an answer. And so this is a knowledge base that tries to answer all questions, whereas science theoretically is only supposed to probably answer the questions that it's reasonably good at answering, or thinks it can answer, or has some evidence it can answer. Again, I'm talking in theory, although the practice, and we'll talk about this in the war part, is that sometimes these boundaries are crossed. So that said, even the harshest critic sort of needs to acknowledge that, like, a lot of practical wisdom comes from religions from around the world and helps people cope with, life, right? Life has many difficulties, and religions offer wisdom that often helps people cope with day-to-day life in a positive way. Now, I will also say that it's worth acknowledging that plenty of evil has been done in the name of religions. All religions I know have had evil done in the name of them. There have been, Buddhism is like, Christianity is a religion of peace and love. Yet, the Inquisition happened under Christianity, which was, torture. And Buddhism is supposed to be a religion of peace and love. Yet there were wars waged under the name of Buddhism. And all I want to say is that that doesn't necessarily make the religions bad or useless. It just means that bad people do bad things in the name of religion. And I would caution people to not just say religion is bad like I used to do, and realize that religion does have some value, and I'm going to try to make an argument that it does have value tonight, and that there's a value to it. So religion and spirituality. George, go ahead.
The only thing I would say about evils and religion is to note that the Holocaust was carried out in the name of science, was carried out in the name of eugenics.
Yep.
So,
and evil is done in the name of all of the above. I think that's a great point, George, is evil is done in the name of all of the above. And so it's not religion only it's just that religion usually is the one that gets pigeonholed as all this evil has been done in the name of religion, but a lot of evil has been done in the name of science. And so I think that's a great point, George. Thank you for making it. Marissa.
Yes, in the Tanakh or the Bible, it talks about how, the Jews were supposed to kill all the Canaanites, and they chose not to, which caused problems. But, even though religion tells you to do something, there's other choices, and other religions have chosen not to do that. That's all I wanted to say.
Great, thanks, Marissa. Claudio.
Yes, I agree with you that the history of religion does have blood on its hands regarding the Crusades, the Inquisition, right, which lasted hundreds of years. And I also agree that science too has blood in its hands too, with the weapons of war. We got Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then you have, of course, Hitler, probably the most evil figure in history, who was a social Darwinist. So he justified the mass murder of innocent people, 6 million Jews, because based on biology, their race, racial purity. So he was right. Okay, just wanted to include that. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudio. In fact, there's something that I learned about Buddhism from a friend of mine. A good friend is that's a former Buddhist monk. Is that Buddhism says there are 3 things that stand in the way of spiritual enlightenment. One is greed, one is anger, which are both obviously bad things. The third is the most important, which is misunderstandings. And I'm working on a paper on ego, and I think that egotism is what I mean when I say ego. I would say egotism is the root cause of all 3 of those things. And I think that Hitler's understanding of science was a misunderstanding, and so his rationalization was a true misunderstanding of what the science of evolution is really about. And so I think it's really important for all of us to just remember that we all have misunderstandings. Every one of us, I guarantee you. The only people that I joke in my company, I don't hire perfect people because perfect people stopped improving the day they thought they were perfect, and so they're the most flawed people that exist. And so all of us are imperfect. We're all flawed in some way, and we all have room for improvement. And the whole point of the Free Thinker Institute, quite frankly, is to help each one of us be the best version of ourselves, and to help each other seek truth together so that we can combat those misunderstandings that we all have. And only by having people around us that are, loyal to truth rather than loyal to each other, and really by being loyal to truth, we are loyal to each other, if you want my perspective. And so really that's the whole point of my not-for-profit, is to help people do those things. And that's why we're having this lecture tonight, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to digress too much, but great points. Thank you for making them. So next agenda item is going to be, is there really a war going on? So I'm going to say there is, and I'm going to bring up a very controversial topic, one that we'll have another talk on another night, and I'll get more into detail. But I will say science very often says that free will doesn't exist, but then act like it does. And philosophers generally agree with that. The philosophy that covers this, the philosophical perspective, is compatibilism, which is more or less to say we have free will, but determinism is right, and therefore we're not making choices but we do have free will, and we should act like we have free will. And that I find is fascinating. Whereas religion and spirituality generally say we have free will, and again, these are generalizations. Like, there are probably religions that say that we don't have free will. I think Calvinism may be one, but my religious history is not nearly as good as Neville, so let me let him talk.
No, I just wanted to let you know that I'm probably one of the few compatibilists around. I mean, perhaps that's an overstatement. I think there's probably quite a few of us around.
Yeah.
In terms of compatibilist philosophers, that have really thought this through. And so I just wanted to, I'm just saying I'm really encouraged in terms of where you're heading.
Cool. So if you're a compatibilist, Neville, I would love to chat with you about that on the online community offline. I'm not gonna actually agree with compatibilism per se, so don't be too encouraged for that. But I will say that the majority of philosophers, according to the survey of philosophers, said that the majority of philosophers do agree with compatibilism. So I'm actually the redheaded stepchild that believes in libertarian free will, and we're a very small minority, maybe second smallest. The hard determinists saying that, don't even act like you have free will, just pretend that you don't, are I think the smallest, if I remember right. But that said, tonight's not about free will. Lovely subject, love it. Have discussed it since I wrote my paper on free will in 2007. And I think we should do that another night, and I'm going to ask at the end of the night, or maybe I don't think I have a survey prepared for tonight, but we will probably email out a survey. That's why we have people register for this now. is we want to be able to email a survey to ask for feedback about the session afterwards. And we will probably email out about what topics you guys are interested in for future events. So yeah. So that said, you know,
Her pass is hand raised.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a quick point. Yeah, free will. Calvinists believe that nothing you do on earth changes a preordained, determination of whether you go to heaven or not.
That, Herb.
Yeah, but you can still have free will on earth.
Got it.
It doesn't contradict that.
Got it. Thanks. I got that wrong. And again, I'm not sure if there are religions and spiritualities that don't believe in free will. The ones that I know about generally do. So, James.
My impression, I've looked at this, carefully because I talked to people. I don't find that there's very many determinists out there. There's a few scientists, I think it's very few, that are extremely noisy about determinism, But I don't think it's like a majority of scientists, people who understand quantum mechanics usually aren't determinists.
Right.
Einstein was not a determinist.
Yeah.
This idea that scientists are determinists is just I think it's a propaganda that was kind of like spread around by very few people. It's not, like maybe some science bloggers and, and a few physicists, but not very many. So I think it's not a scientific, and also the behavioral psychology maybe perhaps depends on a deterministic notion, but not most science.
Yeah, in fact, I think Scientific American had an article saying 60% of people believe in free will. The problem is that those people include compatibilists, which actually are determinists. So compatibilism believes that free will is compatible with determinism. So, but again, I don't want to talk about free will because that's a topic for its own night. But I appreciate your comments, and I hope you're right, James. But I will say you're right that some very loud people are determinists, and so some very loud scientists like Dawkins and a couple of others, Sam Harris and but anyway. So that said, while there's not a major conflict about free will because pretty much everybody says act like you have free will, there is a conflict in whether or not we actually have free will, from a technical perspective. So that said, another one is the origins of the universe. I alluded to that earlier. Science says the universe began at the Big Bang. Creationists say that the universe began a few thousand years ago. And there's a conflict there because, there's a lot of, if we think that the Earth began 3,000 years ago, there's a lot of things about evolution that we shouldn't believe in because evolution goes back much further than the 3,000 years. So that creates a conflict between the scientific paradigm and the religious paradigm. And kids are growing up with both of these from families that are both science-based and religious-based. And a lot of schools teach both science and creationism. And so there's an inherent conflict in terms of a contradiction there. And let me let Sarah talk.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was having a conversation about free will with a friend of mine because he was saying there was no free will. And I told him free will is basically, you're limited by your nature. For instance, if you have a fish in a pond, it can go any direction it wants, only in that pond, only in the water. You know what I mean? So you're limited only by your physical thing, but
right.
I feel like you do have free will to go left, to go right, to go up, to go down, but that's it.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. And all versions of free will that any reasonable person advocate for are limited because free will that's unlimited is actually called omnipotence. And really none of us are advocating for every human being omnipotent, right? So free will saying there's no free will, we can't fly is a nonsensical argument. So, but we'll save that for the free will night. Sorry, but I agree with you totally, Sarah. And like, I've heard those arguments a lot, and I find it fascinating that people use that. But you know, it is super common, so it's not unusual at all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Gridels' incompleteness theorem. Sarah, you may want to put your, okay, you did put your hand on, great. So I just wanted to make sure you didn't have another question. So in Gridels' incompleteness theorem, and I'm going to ask you guys to believe this on faith in this slide, and then I'm going to try to prove it to you in the next slide, but it's going to be a little bit of a mind bender. And I will tell you that when I first learned about Gridels' incompleteness theorem, I was, as I said, a determinist atheist. And I said, this disrupts my paradigm. It's absolutely wrong, and I'm going to go about proving Gridel wrong. And so I, as a computer science student at my university, said, Gridel must be wrong because this would disprove determinism. I inherently saw that quickly, and I turned out to be wrong, and Gridel won the day. So that said, I'm going to explain to you Gridel's perspective and the insight. First, I'm going to start with the insight rather than his little tricky question, which is fun and a mind bender. But basically, what Gridels' incompleteness theorem shows is, you know, I think super interesting, very insightful and deep, and has created a lot of philosophical insights for me. So what it shows is that a logically consistent knowledge base cannot show all truths ever. And there is a condition for that. It's what's called any system that contains Robinson arithmetic, which, without going into details, is pretty much like, you know, if you, it's, you know, most logical systems that you would imagine probably contain Robinson arithmetic. So it's not a huge caveat to give, but it is a caveat to the algorithm or to the theorem. Now, the interesting part is that only a logically inconsistent knowledge base can actually show all truths accurately. However, its veracity or its truth level cannot be logically evaluated consistently because it's an inconsistent knowledge base, and there are inconsistencies that is in that knowledge base. So you can't start from axioms, rules of inference, and scientific experiments and prove true all the things that are true. If you want to prove true all the things that are true, you have to have some inconsistencies in your knowledge base. And that's what Gridels' incompleteness theorem shows, is that there's what science proves true now, there's what absolute knowledge of science can prove true, and there's the things that science can never prove true, but actually are true. And I want to let Neville speak.
I mean, coincidence is a topic for another time, but it just coincidentally, I just produced a paper yesterday for my philosophy cafe on Sunday, and we're going to discuss the philosophy of, well, inverted commas, the philosophy of everything. And, you know, I came at this exact same sort of issue from a different direction. And it seems to me that Gottfried Lipson, I don't know if I can get why I'm sorry, I have to struggle with pronunciation. Lipson, you know, the 17th century philosopher, you know, he actually, I mean, he's developing this sort of same sort of I think, approach, but from a different direction. And I just wondered whether you might, when you talk about truth in the next slide, whether you're actually going to sort of pick up Lipson.
Tell me if I do, because I don't know him. So if I did, it was inadvertent. And I will be honest, like I'm an inventor by trade. Like I'm a software inventor, and I will often like come up with an idea that I think is an original, and then it turns out someone thought of it before. Now, I don't believe that every idea is already thought that will ever be thought in the history of mankind, which some people have told me. I do think there are unique and novel ideas. For example, the concept of using Gridels' incompleteness theorem with free will was something that people tried to do around the turn of the 20th century. I just think they did it wrong, and I have a paper on free will that I think does it right. But that said, please let me know, Neville, whether or not I'm channeling him, because I would be happy to be standing on the shoulders of giants, even if unintentionally. And I'm happy to give them credit for the first to think the idea. If I thought I came up with the idea, I'm a big believer in
yeah. I mean, that's not a problem. I mean, I'm sure that Godwin, every philosopher also draws in and develops a different, idea. So it's not a
and it
question.
might be unintentional, right? Like in society, we just take for granted a lot of the wisdom that prior philosophers thought, and it's just part of common parlance now. And we inadvertently draw on it, even if we don't know we are. But I like to like cite things and source like who thought the like ideas that like when I learned about the Serenity Prayer, I loved the Serenity Prayer. But then when I started getting interested in Stoicism, I realized the Serenity Prayer is just a repackaging of Stoic practical wisdom. Separate what's in your control from what's out of your control and focus your happiness on what's in your control. That's really the Serenity Prayer. And so now the Serenity Prayer says it more beautifully, and I love it. But that said, I like to, anytime that I'm drawing on other people, even if it's without my knowledge, I like to add the right sort of references to the people who thought of those ideas first. So anytime that you can help me do that, I'd like to include those in my papers. They're all, I don't publish academically. I'm not an academic. I'm a computer science undergrad. So, but I still, even informally, when I write stuff, I like to cite sources and like give people credit where it's due. So.
Yeah, can I just give you one very short sentence that explains Libson?
Sure.
So he makes a distinction between two kinds of truth: necessary and contingent truth. Then he leads him into to thinking about infinity, which you probably understand a lot better than I do, in terms of mathematics and science. And then that sort of leads into the whole philosophical discussion, which has developed over the centuries around closed and open systems.
So that gets into another topic, closed and open systems, which gets into the origin of the universe topic, which is going to be another topic that we'll be able to talk about.
Yeah, but you understand the relation to truth. So when you say a logically
like whether it's a
knowledge
closed
base
truth or
cannot
whether
show
or not
all
it's
truth.
like an expansive truth. Is that what you're trying to talk about?
Well, that's right. I mean, if you've got infinity,
a universal truth.
If you've got two kinds of truth, necessary and contingent, you've got two types of systems, open and closed. And if you have, infinity, that sort of sums up that first statement.
Mm-hmm. So let's
from a different direction.
Yeah, let's see whether or not I don't know. I can't triangulate whether or not it's consistent. I don't think that what I have read a little bit about necessary and contingent, and I don't think it's the same as what I'm going to talk about, but you let me know if I'm wrong. So that said, this is Gridels' Incompleteness theorem, like the very like Cliff's Notes version. So think of a logical system of axioms and rules of inference, right? Things that we just can assume to be true because they're so obvious, and then rules of inference. And then imagine a perfect black box, one that can answer absolutely every question ever asked to it to be perfectly accurately true. This black box we assume is always accurate, okay? So if we ask that black box, which we call a UTM or a universal truth machine, and it has all knowledge of science, not just all knowledge we know, but all knowledge that is knowable by science ever in the history of the world ad infinitum, infinitely in the future. So this is the universal truth machine. It will never get anything wrong, period. Now ask it the question or make the statement, the universal truth, like, and I got this a little bit wrong. You're supposed to phrase it in the series of a question, but make the statement, the universal truth machine will never say this statement is true. Now walk through the logic, right? There's two options here. Either it could say it's true or it could say it's false. Let's first assume that it says it's true. If it says it's true, well, the statement is false because the universal truth machine said it was true, and the statement says that it'll never say it's true. So clearly the universal truth machine is wrong, right? So the universal truth machine can't say that that question is true. Now let's suppose that it says it's false. Well, then the universal truth machine is still wrong because the statement says, and I have a typo here, that the universal truth machine won't say the statement is true. So the statement actually is true, even though the universal truth machine said that it's false. And what I'm going to challenge you to say is that when I first happened upon this, I said, I think that's like a semantic flaw, right? It's just a trick of language. this is not just a trick of language. It's actually a limitation of logical systems. And it is like a hard limitation of logical systems. And what I've come to learn or believe, I'm going to say, because everything I say tonight is my opinion, and you guys have to use your opinion, and that's part of the Free Thinker Institute, is everyone should use their own critical thinking skills to decide what they think is true. I'm going to give you my opinions tonight, and you can decide if you think they're true. Now, I don't think it's a semantic flaw. What I think is that it's actually inherent limitation of logical systems. And what I mean by that is that a logical system can't handle answering true statements about what I call self-defining statements. And that's what this is. It's a self-defining statement. It's a statement about whether the universal truth machine will ever say this statement is true. And so it's a self-defining statement. And another night I can talk about a whole nother class of self-defining statements. When we talk about free will, I'd like to come back to that. But let me just say that logical systems that are consistent are limited in what they can prove true because of this inherent limitation of what logical systems can prove. Neville.
I'm terribly sorry about this,
No.
Garrett. I mean, it's just that, you know, I've written this paper yesterday that was just exactly on this thing. So
Cool.
you know, so simply, isn't it just paradox as well?
So paradoxes are like really logical inconsistencies, right? And so yes, it is a paradox, right? But the thing that we can learn by there being a paradox about this, it's called a proof by contradiction in computer science, where when you assume something is true and then you come to a logical inconsistency, you can then logically infer that the thing that you thought was true is basically false because you came to a contradiction by assuming it was true. And so that's really what this does. Is what I've proven essentially is that no universal truth machine exists. Like, it doesn't exist in the form of a logical system. And so it's a proof by contradiction. And one of the strengths that I have in my dabbling in philosophy as a hobbyist practical philosopher, which is what I call myself, I'm focused on practical philosophy rather than academic philosophy, is that I study computer science. And so I've written logical proofs that, you know, had to hold up to computer science professors. One of my professors won the Genius Award, and you know, I had to write proofs that satisfied him. So I'm pretty good at logic. Like, that's one of my strengths. Don't ask me to draw a picture. I'm terrible at that. My kids do better, but like logical proofs I'm good at, logical arguments I'm good at. So speaking of which, let's talk about truth. So now that we've talked about Gridels' incompleteness theorem and the fact that logical systems have limitations to what truths they can prove, I'm going to say that there are two types of truths in the world. I'm going to call the truths that logical systems can prove, meaning that science can prove, if I'm going to like channel the difference between logical, you know, consistent knowledge bases and inconsistent knowledge bases, which is really the technical language, but the real like day-to-day language that we're talking about is science versus spirituality and religion. Objective truths are what science proves. They're things about the world. They're scientifically provable truths through experimentation and logic, whereas I'm going to name another type of truth, which I call subjective truths, which are truths related to self-defining statements. For example, you know, I'm going to give examples of, you know, what I would consider subjective truths is whether or not I prefer Cheerios or cornflakes, right? That's not something that you can run a scientific experiment. You could figure out like, what do I eat every day for like 10 years, but I might change my mind after that. What are you going to do then, right? Like, I'm entitled to change my mind about what I like after 10 years, and some people do. So it's a subjective truth. There's no scientifically verifiable with near certainty about what's true or not. What are your values? I would argue that's another version of subjective truth. What values do I ascribe to? Which ones do I relate to me? I'm defining that for myself. And that's why I call it like a self-defining statement, because I, as a person, am defining it for myself. And this is where the free will kind of comes into it, because I'm sort of assuming free will here, mostly because most people assume free will, even the determinists do. So I'm going to kind of go with like the examples being free will examples, because I don't have really great examples outside of free will examples, that I thought of quickly. So I'm using those as examples. What are my life's goals, right? I'd argue that they're actually guidelines we should all use for our life's goals, because I think that choosing your life's goal to be a serial murderer is not equal to having your life's goal to be an artist, right? Like being an artist doesn't cause anyone harm. And I think causing unnecessary harm is not a good thing that we should all do. And so, I would argue that there are limitations to what we choose to be our life's goals, but choosing our life's goals within some boundaries of reason are subjective truths. Does that make sense between objective and subjective truths? And sort of like the paradigm between objective truths are essentially, and you see where this conversation is going, right? Objective truths are really clearly proven by science, whereas subjective truths are more in the realm of spirituality and religion, right? And so that's where we're going. But before we go there and talk about peace, which is what I'm alluding to, I'm going to talk about the root cause of the war, which is the root cause of the problem. And James.
Yeah. So how do you know that this is not just an ideology? In other words, the idea that subjective truths have to be different from objective truths, that subjective truths or the truths that are held out of individual reason cannot be based on science.
Are you asserting that, or are you asking a question? I'm sorry.
Well, it's just asking you, how did you come to the view that this is not a dogma?
So when you say that it's that it's not a dogma, what do you mean?
Well, I mean that there is a division between subjective truth and objective truth.
So that was what Gridels' Incompleteness theorem shows, right? Is that there are truths that can be proven by logical systems, and there are truths that are true that logical, consistent systems cannot prove. So I kind of created this paradigm of these two types of truth, and then I just gave them definitions. Like I logically proved they both exist with Gridels' Incompleteness theorem, and then what I did is I gave them names because I think it's powerful to give something a name. And the names that I bestowed upon the truths that logical, consistent systems can give, I'm naming objective truths. The truths that logical, consistent systems cannot prove but are still true, I'm calling subjective truths. So now, dogma is a complicated term, and I think you could probably make an argument that it is a dogma. You could make an argument that a lot of stuff is a dogma, but I think that it's a logically defensible position either way.
So you came to the point of view that people prove things logically, and if they prove things logically, then they're not true.
No, so I'm sorry if I gave that impression. What I was trying to say is that there are things about objective reality that are logically provable to be true about objective reality, like, and those things can be proven through scientific experimentation and logic. And where we get consistent, like good, consistent answers from those paradigms, they're very good at what they do. And we'll talk more about that. And they are true. Like, all I'm saying is that they are limited in what they can prove to be true. And there are other true things in the universe that those systems can't prove true. And so there are two, what I would call types of truth. There's the objective truths about objective reality, and there are the subjective truths that consistent paradigms of consistent knowledge bases can't prove true because they're incapable of it, according to Gridels' Incompleteness theorem. Does that make better sense?
I think that the word using the word subjective for that assertion sounds ridiculous to me. It's not built into the individual. It's not built into the mind. It's not built in error and closed systems is not built into the use of logic by the mind. It's not, there's no division. To me, the artificial construct you're trying to create is between subjectivity and objectivity, in my opinion. Yeah,
I do think that, so we would have to talk more about what you mean by that. But I think that I'm not sure what like, I guess I see us as saying the same things, and I'm not sure why they're different from your perspective.
Well, you're creating a kind of a bag called subjective truth. Now, what is subjective truth? It has to be what I think or you think. It's no longer.
Yeah, it's truths that individuals define for themselves that are not in conflict with objective reality.
well, okay, so why do you call it? So I'm not really sure.
Because
Why-
I believe it's
what-
true
what-
from my own perspective. And so it's my subjective truth. You can believe your truths are true from your perspective because I can have my life's goals and my values, and you can have your life's goals and your values. They are our subjective truths.
So I don't understand how you relate that to Gödel's theorem or how you relate that to objective truth.
So the way to relate it is if you look at the things that science can't ever prove true but are true, those are like your subjective truths and my subjective truths are things that science can never prove true. Science can never prove true what your values are, right? You decide your values. They're your own truth, and your values don't conflict with objective reality. Whereas like you could have an opinion that the door on my my room doesn't exist and have it be closed, and as soon as you tried to walk through it, reality would tell you that door is really there, right? So a subjective truth is a truth that does not conflict with objective reality, whereas objective reality is, you know, what science will eventually be able to prove true with enough time and knowledge and effort. Is that making
So I think your dogma is to creating a separate subjective truth, which is based on something different, the closed world of the individual, and then putting it in the third category.
I guess I'm thinking there are two categories, which is objective truths and subjective truths, but
Right, you are.
okay. Okay, cool. So Neville and then Claudio.
That was a little bit frustrating for me because hi James.
Hi,
I know
Neville. How you
James.
doing?
I've discussed this with James on different topics and in different relationships. I mean, you know, I think this is the semantic confusion, you know, because what Garrett's talking about is, you know, something different, I think, James, than what you're trying to raise. It is semantically different, you know, so, and in some sense at cross purpose, because, let me try and, you know, I've looked at the language and meaning, the semantics in dogma. And in a sense, what Garrett is trying to develop is framed in a mathematic, probably more so than, and also in sort of a theoretical science approach, which, if you think about it, James, there is not a necessity in terms of where the rubber hits the road in what you're saying in terms of the ontology, in terms of, which is a different discussion, a different way of understanding subjectivity and objectivity, which doesn't necessarily cut against the epistemology, which sort of arises out of what Garrett's saying. I know that's probably a little bit unclear for those that don't understand the philosophy across the different fields, which is what in some sense where the semantic confusion comes from, because, you know, people think there's a conflict in, you know, when, say, Garrett talks about two types of truth that arises out of an understanding of mathematics, but it's not dogma. It's simply a process of arriving at a model and a way of approaching. That does not, I mean, there is no rubber hitting the road in terms of another model or another approach which has different semantics, different meanings, in terms of if you were doing it in ontology or if you were looking at a different epistemological model.
Yeah, and I guess I'm sorry, James, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the problem arises because of the need, the imagined need to create a distinction between scientific truth and truth that arises independent of scientific disciplines and methods and efforts.
That's because people
try to put truth into categories, spiritual truth.
Yeah, but the problem is
factual truth.
People outside the disciplines get confused because they don't understand what a model is. And a model isn't a statement of an actuality out there. It is a statement about trying to understand truthfully the best that we can, fallibly what we can. So, I don't think Garrett is sort of saying this is a philosophy of everything. This is the whole picture. He's just presenting something that, in some sense, that if you understand the different nuances in the meanings and the truths that he's trying to present, then there is no problem.
Yeah, and I would actually, James, as I thought about it more, because I was on the spot when you said dogma, I would take a little issue with dogma because that assumes there's some authority. I'm not claiming to be an authority. The only authority that I would argue I'm drawing on is that of logic, and if you trust like logic and our own knowledge, which is the only authority that I think that I really hold to, is to trust our own ability to reason and our own logic and our own observations and ability to create inferences about the world. That that's the only way that you could look at it as a dogma. But it's there's no authority that's presenting this. It's just a logical argument of the limitations of what logical systems can do and what they can learn, and then giving names to what logical systems can teach us and what they can't teach us. And then that's all I've done so far. It's pretty basic, to be honest. But I think
the names you chose can be misleading.
I agree with you. The names are, so I'm not a semantics guy. We can call one squiggly wig and the other one diddly do. I have no problem with that. So I just tried to use names that might resonate with people for the most part, but I am not tied to names at all. So you can rename those in your head as much as you want. I'm definitely not tied to names. I don't think that they're valuable other than in communicating concepts and ideas and logic and knowledge and truth. So yeah, I'm not tied to the names at all. So fair point.
Claudio is next.
Yeah, please, Claudio.
Thank you. Well, I must say, firstly, that this is one of the best philosophy meetups that I've attended since the start of the pandemic.
That is so kind of you, Claudio. And I have to actually say thank you to the audience, because we've had such great questions. I think that the audience is what's making it the best. So
yeah, this is I like the information that you're presenting here. It's very important, science and religion. I was wondering, under the category of subjective truths, you mentioned spirituality and religion. Would you broaden that category to include, let's say, things like subjective truths arising, let's say, from personal experiences, culture, upbringing, from peers, geography, morality, genes? Would you consider any of those part of the subjective truths? Because our experiences do influence what we believe in later, about how we behave. And, for example, especially say a traumatic experience in the past, you can develop certain truths, personal truths.
Yeah, I would argue that a subjective truth is anything you believe that does not conflict with objective reality. And objective truths are statements about objective reality. And so that's where I would make the clean, hopefully it's a clean distinction, is you can believe anything you want, but if your belief conflicts with objective reality, and that's where I say, I give the example of 3 philosophers stand in front of a door. 2 of them say the door doesn't exist and they try to walk through it, they're going to run into the door. And, majority does not make reality. And even if a majority of people agree with something, it doesn't make it reality. And so any subjective truth to me is fair game. Any subjective belief is fair game, as long as it does not conflict with objective reality. Now, there's a big gray area there, because does it conflict with objective reality? Yes or no? There's a lot of gray area in a lot of subjects. And ultimately, we have to all use our own critical thinking skills to decide where do we draw the line. But yeah, it's a great point.
Mickey Noella.
Yeah, go ahead, Mickey. Thank you, Lois.
Thank you so much. Sorry about me not being able to be on camera, but I really appreciate you having this talk.
It's okay.
I
Maybe next time, Mickey.
yeah, maybe next time I'll get all dolled up for you guys. But I really appreciate the way that you presented the information. It actually was quite clear to me, and I understood it immediately, so it was very helpful. What I am curious about is under the subjective truth option, when you explained it in terms of someone's position or their opinion about, you know, whatever their truth is. And I thank you for the distinction you gave to Claudio about as long as it doesn't conflict with objective reality. I'm curious to know if you can give an example of a subjective truth that doesn't originate from an opinion that would be in that third category, or if that thing that doesn't have anything to do with my opinion, is there a subjective truth like that? And if there isn't, does it then get moved into the second category of additional knowledge that we have faith that at some point science will? Does that make sense, my question?
I think, let me just make sure I'm going to restate it and make sure that I'm understanding it, Mickey. I think you're asking for an example of a subjective truth that does not come from a sentient being. Is that true?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I don't think that there are any, to be honest. That's just my hypothesis, and it's my gut reaction. Because I think that sentient beings are where subjective truths come from. But I welcome anyone that has a better example. And I will give the caveat that I'm a closeted introvert. I'm now an ambivert, slightly extroverted, but like my roots are deeply introverted. So I want to reserve the right to think more about that, and let anyone feel free to disagree with me and give a logical reason why.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. It really helps add clarity to the conversation, so I appreciate it. If anyone has, I want to finish that. Neville and Sarah and George are next in line, but I want to see if anyone has an example of a subjective truth that they think comes from a non-sentient being. Feel free to write it in the online community afterwards. I waited 2 seconds, and that's kind of the rule, that if someone wants to speak up, they speak up in 2 seconds. That's what I've read from my business background. So Neville, why don't you go next?
Yeah, look, I'm going to be very quick. Yeah, so I think Carnap, you know, and I disagree with a lot of what Carnap says, you know, as a logical positivist, but I think he introduced the idea of internal questions and external questions, and I think this is where the semantics gets confused. So that, you know, the thing is that there is an overlap in terms of understanding subjective truths and objective truths, but that has to do with what question we are asking. And so in philosophy, people might be aware, or they may not be aware, you know, there's a whole lot of range of debates across different fields on what's called internalism and externalism. So I think this is where the semantics gets confused, because religion and spirituality, or non-science, actually sort of employs objective truths because they are truths within the frame and about the subject. They are also, as I just stated about the subject, but they're also subjective as well. So it's just really, I think a lot of people talk cross-purpose in a cross-purpose way because they haven't clarified the exact question that's being asked.
Yeah, we're going to get into clarifying the exact question being asked a little later. So I'm glad you're bringing that up, Neville. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Yeah. In Einstein's theory of relativity, which I did not finish because I couldn't, he's not the only person to write about this anyway, but he talks about perspective and how there can be truths based on your perspective. For instance, there's a train traveling, somebody throws a ball off the back of the train. If you're above the train, you see the ball go in a straight line. If you're next to the train, you see the ball go in an arc. If you're behind it, you see the ball go up and then down. And all of those are true, but they're totally relative to where you are. I don't know if that fits into being subjective, but I think it does.
It's a very interesting point, Sarah. I would argue that it does, but and I studied relativity in my honors mechanics class in college, so I learned a little bit about it. We only dabbled in it. We were mostly focused on mechanics, but we dabbled in relativity. And so I got some fun problems that were mind-bending and seemed super counterintuitive when it comes to near light speed travel. But what I would say from what I've learned from then and since then is that the perspective of whether the ball is moving up and down or left and right, etc., is a subjective truth because it's from the perspective of the observer. Where that ball is in 3 space, it has a specific location and movement, but the sight and the view of it is from a sentient being's perspective, and by being rooted in a sentient being's perspective, the way that it is perceived could be different, but the actual objective location of that ball in 3 space at a point in time space is, I think, objective. And so the ball has a deterministic time space location at any given moment, but the way that it's viewed is subjective. So it's
right.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think that's how it fits into different cultures having different subjective truth, because it's like you were saying, cornflakes. Say there's no cornflakes in Ireland.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? But it's
right.
Like,
no one's got that as their favorite.
Exactly. So
yeah.
It is kind of have to do with your culture and everything.
Yeah.
That makes up their subjective truth.
That's a super great point, Sarah. And it's going to come back when we talk about another week. We're going to talk about morality and about whether or not there are any objective morals. And if so, what are they dependent on? And I would argue that if there are objective morals, they are dependent on the knowledge that someone has about the world, and therefore are what we've been exposed to in our lives influences those. And some people would say that it's not an objective moral at all, but let's not get into that. Let's just say that'll be an interesting conversation for another day. We have free will, objective morality. We'll have a bunch of other subjects that we can talk about, and we can see what people want the most. George, can you go next?
Yes. I guess my response is that this is all just terrifyingly simplistic. So the notion of an objective truth, okay, there's a door. Someone says there's a door, another person says there's not a door. Well, maybe the person that means, yeah, there's a piece of wood there. In other words, the very notion of door is a dogma, right? The very idea that we identify car is a dogma. So even we'll pass this for objective truth really is just a dogma, and really is just really what we agree to what door is or what wall is. And even subjective truth, I could say, okay, my life's goal is to be happy, right? Well, okay, and I think that being a lawyer is going to make me happy. Someone could say, no, that's not going to make you happy. Are they wrong? No, they might be right. And so, even again, we could try to simplify things in a way that really are denuded of any real meaning or any real psychological insight. And so that's why, you're taking this sort of logic stance and you're putting things out there as self-evident when really they are a lot more complicated than that, right? So even subjective truth, I mean, people will say, no, I'm straight. And then later they come out as gay. Now, maybe they thought they were straight, right? But then later they're gay. So even subjective truth, how do we know if someone's, eating something, do they really like it or not, right? Yeah. How do we know that's the truth, right? And so I guess, and I know you're building onto something, but I'm looking at this and I'm saying objective truth, even in terms of objects around us, right? Again, how do we define things? Again, it's just much more complicated than the way it's being presented. I hope I'm not being too harsh in what I'm saying.
Fine, George. So you're right. I am trying to take that into consideration in the way that I'm presenting. I'm showing black and white, but I'm also showing shades of gray, right? I'm showing the black is, Earth is an oblate spheroid, like pretty clear that that's true. And I'm showing white, like I like Cheerios or cornflakes, well, I get to decide that myself. No one's going to prove whether I like Cheerios or cornflakes with some PhD's experiment. And I'm going to say there's a ton of gray in between. And where you line up with that gray is like up to you individually.
But let me say this.
Go ahead.
Even in terms of the shape of the earth, okay? If you factor in the mountains, I mean, then it's not really a sphere anymore, right? Not in the conventional sense
sphere. I said oblate spheroid.
Again?
But like, you know, again, like I don't want to get into semantics. Like you, I feel like you like semantics, and I get that. Like,
I'm not arguing for semantics.
Okay.
I'm not arguing for semantics, quite the contrary. But what I'm simply saying is that you can't sweep things aside simply, oh, that's a semantic. You're sweeping it aside.
No, right? I'm not trying to. I'm just saying that there's two ends of the extreme, and then there's everything in between. And all I'm saying is that, you know, these two extremes exist. There's objective reality and there's objective truths and subjective truths. And we need to decide for ourselves which one something is. And we're going to talk about like how to get better at that.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So, James.
Thank you. I just wanted, just on relativity, I'm sure your physics teacher was really excellent in what he covered, but there in relativity, there's no such thing as absolute time space. There's no fixed time space. Everything, all distances and events are relative, occur in relative time space. So it's just a question of what you're relative to. And when you do these thought experiments or these these experiments that involve sentient beings, the results would be the same if you just had mechanical recordings of these events. The results would still be the same. They would all be dependent on time space always being relative. So the events that occur relative to different points in the time space always divulge different phenomenal information. That is the theory of relativity. It doesn't involve any absolute time space whatsoever.
So just to be clear, James, I wasn't saying that time space has. So how do I describe this? This is complicated stuff, and I don't want to get into the details, but
well, the point is never absolute.
I understand what you're saying. I know where you're coming from, and I understand why you understood what you thought I said as what you perceived it as. That's not what I was trying to say. I'm not trying to say that, you know, four-dimensional space is a fixed frame and that there's like a fixed point in time space at which the ball exists. But what I'm saying is, from the frame of an individual, there is a perception of what is reality. And depending on the frame of the individual, it's different, but the existence of the ball exists at a certain place. And if you take into consideration the different frames that are in different positions, you can calculate how each one of them perceives the ball. And so that's when I say, like, there is a fixed place that the ball exists in. It is a scientifically calculable thing to say from each frame's perspective, how is the ball perceived? And what I was saying is, from each perspective, the ball may look different, but the ball is the ball. It's just perceived differently from different perspectives, different frames.
So you understand it has nothing to do with the sentience of the.
So I don't think that that's clear. And that is probably a topic for a different perspective. Like, you can't make an observation without having a sentient being making the observation. Eventually, a sentient being has to observe something for it to be observed. You can have a mechanism like record something, but if no one ever reads it, it was never observed in the first place. So actually, I would posit that no observation can ever be made except from the perspective of the frame of a sentient being.
That's my definition of a semantical explanation. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. So, the root cause of the war is that science tries to answer questions about subjective truth, which are and basically, you know, like the origin of consciousness or free will. Religion tries to answer questions about objective truth, like how people have evolved throughout time and the age of the earth. Those questions are answered pretty well by accepted science today, which is, not really like, it's very independently verifiable through, clear cause and effect that is reasonably deterministic and very predictable. And so those are the situations where you have science, which is really good at answering questions about objective truth, trying to answer questions about subjective truths. And then you have religion, which is really good at answering subjective truths, trying to answer questions about objective reality. Now, 2,000 years ago, we didn't have what we have in science today. And so religion was the paradigm to answer all questions by, and so it was answering all the questions. Neville
has, yeah.
I don't disagree with you, Garrett. I just think it's the way you're packaging, perhaps. Okay. So I think, perhaps you're saying the root cause of the war is perhaps unhelpful for what you're actually saying. So I think that, if you explore subjective truths, and you've said it yourself, I mean, there's misunderstandings. And I think that the trouble is, again, what I've been saying about the cross purposes in the semantics is that, and I'm speaking here because as I mentioned to you on the website, I published a paper on trying to find peace in what I call cultural history war. But in many ways it overlaps and comes into what you're saying as well. It involves science, debates about science. But I think, the trouble that I struggle with is that, like you, there's a whole lot of knowledge base here, and the knowledge base comes from different disciplines, comes across from different disciplines. And the trouble is the subjective person who's stating their truth doesn't understand the whole framing in terms of an internal and external question. You've got a particular specific question, and that's what I've been trying to say to people on the chat. Garrett's just trying to present a model here, right, which is, used for a measurement of beliefs. That is, it's where does it fit on a spectrum? Yeah. And I think that's brilliant. I think that's legitimate. Yeah. But I think people get confused because, in some sense, they're not seeing that perhaps that you're coming at this at a legitimate and important question, and you're not saying, and as you've repeatedly said, that there are other questions, there are other answers in terms around warfare, the cultural and historical or science warfare or religion warfare, and that there can be more than one root cause.
Yep, totally right, Neville. I'm just trying to say there's black, there's white, and there's gray in between, and we each have to decide for self where the gray is. And that's where, the Freethinker Institute intentions are about, like, listen with an open mind, be the best version of ourselves, seek truth, and use our critical thinking skills to decide what we think is right along that paradigm. But to know that both paradigms exist and they can coexist compatibly, and that's what we're going to get to next. But Mickey, I want to let you ask a question or speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify this again. Thank you. It's very clear to me. I really am able to follow it. But I wanted to clarify in the first paragraph, did you mean that science is capable of that or incapable? On this slide, the root cause of war, don't you mean incapable?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mickey. It was incapable. You're clearly understanding well, catching my mistakes. I appreciate that.
All good, no problem.
So you'll find that I like to say the only time that someone is wrong is when it's clear that they're wrong and they don't admit it. Very important to admit when we're wrong. I was wrong there. So Herb, go ahead. Herb, sorry. You're on mute still, Herb.
Okay, I'm audible.
Great.
there was a philosopher of science who operated from the 1930s to the early 1970s, Michael Polanyi, originally from Hungary, who wound up in England and also gave lectures at the University of Chicago in America. And he said that there's a certain way in which you need to bring the subjective and the objective together. And there he was talking about truth finding, not combinations of known objective truths. What he was saying was, if you have something, maybe it's your own work or you're criticizing somebody else's work, either way, you need to evaluate it from everything you know, including your gut feelings. You have a responsibility to do this, and that when you're doing that, you're operating at the border of the subjective and objective, because you're taking into account objective findings and also all those things you know, like the person, let's say it's somebody else who did this, maybe you know some things about how they were trained, were they really trained carefully or not in a good way, where you have less confidence in the results. So I just want to make people aware of his position that the subjective element is essential, but it has to be balanced by the objective one, and there's a stewardship involved.
Agreed completely, and that gets into a conversation. I think it would be fun to do a conversation about religion in general, and I would argue that all religions, no matter what, need to be interpreted by someone, right? Because the religious book is just a book. We have to read it and understand what it says. And even if we believe what our religious leaders say, some of them may disagree with each other, and we have to believe which one we believe is more right. And so there's always, and even they have to read the religious text and subjectively interpret it. And this was actually, I was giving this like a preview to one of the board members of the Freethinker Institute earlier today. And this topic came up as they were, challenging me with questions. And I think we should do that for another night because we're already running late. But it's a great point, and I think that everything needs to be interpreted, right? We if it's not interpreted, it just exists, and everything needs to be interpreted.
But there's another dimension in which it gets interpreted, and that's if you have certain values, then it's a question of how do you act on them, and what do you do, and how do you work with other people to achieve things.
And then we get to morality, which is another one that I'll table, but I'm super excited to chat with you all about because I am a redheaded stepchild of redheaded stepchildren there. In trying to make an argument for objective morality when I'm not religious. I'm like probably the only one doing that, but I'll make an effort and welcome any criticism. But we'll do that another night. So let's get to how do we create peace to end the war? And it's really, I've hopefully set the stage for it. At least I have for Mickey, I know that. So hopefully it resonates with some other people, which is not to look at them as competitive. Don't look at spirituality and science as competitive. You can look at there is battleground territory, and there is, and realistically there is, and there probably will be for the foreseeable future. There's like territory where, it's unclear which one is the right one to answer the paradigm. However, they can be very complementary. And the way that I would say is, if science has a solid answer that resonates with your critical thinking skills after listening to it with an open mind, then trust it, right? Because it's consistent and it's really good at answering questions consistently. And if you trust why science says something and you trust that inherently feels right, then go with it. Now, when science doesn't have a clear answer to a question, spiritual and religious guidance is good. And like, it can answer questions that, science can't answer because it doesn't have privy to subjective truths. And science might try to answer those questions. And if someone tells you that they formed an experiment and your life's purpose is to serve them loyally for the rest of your life, well, I highly recommend you decline their offer and say, no, I think I'm going to live my own life. So, we all have to trust our own instincts and our own critical thinking skills. And part of the goal of the Freethinker Institute, we just had an event, I think it was last week, where we tried to hone our critical thinking skills. And that's going to be a part of a part of what what we try to do in events is not only talking about intellectually interesting things, but to help people improve their skills at life skills. And and so that said, I want to sort of end on this slide and basically say, you basically, each one of you needs to decide. What's that? Sorry, was there a question? So each one of you needs to decide, at what level do you accept science, and at what level do you accept spirituality and religion as the right paradigm. But the way that I would recommend looking at it is, there are two paradigms that can answer the questions, right? You can ask the science body of knowledge, or you could ask the spirituality religion body of knowledge. And first you should ask yourself, what kind of question is this? Is this a question that is provable by repeatable experiments? And if so, ask science and say, science, do you have a question? Do you have an answer to this question that is clear enough for me to believe that it's true of my own free will, and volition? Is there a clear answer to this scientific question in the body of knowledge? Now, teleporting humans in 10 years, I'd argue there's not. Pretty clear that there's not an answer of how to teleport humans, right now. If there's no clear answer from your perspective, wherever you decide to draw the line, then spirituality and religion is a good way to answer questions. And it is, if I'm right, it is a logically provable right way to answer questions ad infinitum. It always will be for certain questions. James.
Yeah, I apologize for the funny face. That was an accident.
That's okay. I was worried about what you were going to say next, to be honest. So.
You were asking, I think you were asking for predecessors or, people who came before. I think you just expressed the philosophy of Herbert Spencer about religion and science. So just to let you know, there was a philosopher in England around prior to the turn of the century, the second half of the 20th century, very popular. And he was considered one of the smartest men on the earth around 1880. And he had a philosophy that religion and science were twin pillars of human knowledge, and we're going to evolve into more or less a single fountain of understanding, human understanding of the world, and so forth. So you have predecessors, Garrett.
Thank you, James. I know that I do, and I always find when I wrote my paper on free will about Gridels' Incompleteness theorem, one of my philosophy friends sent me these papers about 20th century philosophers trying to prove free will using Gridels' Incompleteness theorem, and I'm like, wow, I never knew anyone tried to do that. But then I read the papers and I was like, they didn't do it in a way that was convincing to me. But yeah, so thank you, James. And sounds like I'm actually following in very big footsteps, which I'm honored to do. So Herb.
Yeah, bring up the name Clarence Skinner. In the 1920s and 1940s, he was a religious leader of a movement called the Universalists, which have a 200-year history in America. They believe there's no hell, only heaven. Certain reasons for that. They later combined with the Unitarians, so now they call themselves Unitarian Universalists. Okay, so what he said is that science and religion are partners with each other in getting things done, that they each have, they're specialized in certain kinds of insights and values and standards and observations of human, interaction and need. And so he articulated it very well, and he combined it with a set of reasons and methods of getting to a society where you gradually eliminate prejudice, which he called the partials rather than the universals. So yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thanks, Herb. It sounds like we're following in multiple people's famous footsteps. So Neville, do you want to go next?
Wait a second. Sarah Flynn has a question in the comments.
Lois, you're the best.
Was that name Herbert Spencer or something else?
Herbert Spencer is what I heard James say.
Yeah, but what's the question again? Lois?
He asked the name of the person mentioned before. Was that name Herbert Spencer? Or
That's Herbert Spencer, yes.
Okay, thanks.
British philosopher.
Great. Neville, I think, were you next?
Oh, look, just very quickly, just say hello to Herb, and we should catch up. I'm a historian and philosopher of Unitarian Universalism, and also a scholar in American intellectual history. So very
yeah, we should. Yes, I agree.
Great. And then Claudio.
Hi, me, am I next? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, regarding your model, those 2 points, how religion and spirituality can coexist. I was wondering, the following statement I'm about to make, I want your opinion to see if it fits nicely, neatly into those 2 points that you gave. Okay, let's say I were the following statement. I would say, yeah, because science does not really provide an efficient coping mechanism for, let's say, deaths of loved ones, you know, or science isn't capable of relieving, let's say, existential anxiety. I am going to turn to spirituality or religion because it believes in the afterlife and science does not. It believes in near-death experiences as supernatural events. Science does not. Would that fit nicely into that model of yours?
So I think, let me make sure I understood right. And like, I think what you're saying, I'm not sure I understood quite right. Can you just, so like, it sounds like what you're saying is that the paradigm is better said science versus non-science rather than, I'm sorry, science versus non-science rather than science versus spirituality and religion. Maybe I misunderstood, sorry.
No, just like science, in most cases, science doesn't have an answer how to, you know, like for example, how people lose loved ones, right?
Right.
So that science doesn't really have an adequate question how to deal with it, right? And also people experience, because of the mechanistic worldview, a lot of people experience existential anxiety, especially with the advent of neuroscience, reducing everything to mental states.
Right.
So can I say, because science doesn't deal effectively with those 2 areas, the loss of loved ones, right, and existential anxiety, I'm going to turn to spirituality and religion for answers.
Yeah, so I would say, sure, like that's a perfectly acceptable life decision. And when we say neuroscience reduces everything to mental states, I think they have tried to do that, and neuroscience has tried to disprove free will multiple times. I've researched this, and I would say that it hasn't yet done that, from what I can tell. In fact, what I've seen is that they've traced consciousness back to nanotubules in the brain, which is cool and, you know, fits with my hypothesis on free will, which we can talk about another night, and my theory on consciousness, which makes perfect sense to me given the other stuff that I think I've learned from my philosophical meanderings. But like loss of loved ones, like psychologists would say they have a great scientific way of handling loss of loved ones. Personally, you know, I lost my closest family member a couple of years ago to cancer. And my spiritual beliefs, which I came about to because of my meandering in philosophy, helped me cope with that death in a very positive way. And even like, you know, while she was alive, helped me talk with her about it in a way that was very productive. And, you know, we were on the same page, and I think was very conducive to my mental health, given that I was losing my closest family member to cancer. And so I think that every individual has to decide which paradigm to ask each question, and be comfortable with the answer that they come up with. And all I would say is, if you're unhappy, then keep an open mind to new ideas that might be both truthful and help bring you more happiness. And I think it's important to seek both, is to seek truth, but then also look to, you know, seek truth, have an open mind, use your critical thinking skills. And after doing all that, look for ways to help you and those around you be happier and suffer less harm. And I think if you're doing those things and trusting your own judgment, you're going to come to a good answer. I think doing those things sounds easier said than done, and is an effort and takes work. So Sarah, and that's the whole point of the Free Thinker Institute, is to do all that and help each other do all that. So Sarah, let you go next, and then Hussein, I want to hear from you. You raised your hand earlier, but we never got to you. I apologize for that.
Well, first I want to say this is one of my first Zoom meetings. It's been so interesting hearing all these different opinions. I know we're about to end, so I just wanted to say that. When it comes to science, science doesn't discount anything that hasn't been proven or disproven. So science hasn't disregarded the afterlife or heaven or what came before the Big Bang. None of that has been disproven. And, you know, a friend of mine, I was talking to him about something. I'm like, well, you know, I don't think Jesus turned water into wine. And he said to me, it doesn't matter, because that's not what my religion is about. My religion is, if you're hungry, I'm going to come feed you. That's what religion is really about. But regardless of any of that, I was in an abusive relationship with an alcoholic. Don't judge me. Thank you. And when I got out of it, I started taking therapy because I'm super smart. There's no reason why I should have been in that. It can happen to anybody. But in therapy, I learned that therapy comes in a million different forms. You're a therapist, going to the gym, drinking with your friends. And religion, not so much religion itself, but understanding spirituality and peacefulness and not having that craziness in your life was one form. Also, the science of understanding that this guy was totally biologically hooked in, understanding the science of he has a long road to going. And both of those things helped me get past those things. They coincided to get me through that. So yeah, was it?
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm sorry for the difficulty you went through, but congratulations. It sounds like you're on a very good path, and I'm really happy to hear that. So congratulations. Hussein, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Garrett. Now, at the very beginning, I want to say thank you for defining the words science and spirituality. I think that's an improvement in your presentation, so keep doing that, please.
Thank you.
But you did invoke the word truthful and the word happiness. Now, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but I'm going to have to ask you to define truthfulness, because when you think about it, that's really when the rubber hits the road, no matter how much critical thinking skills you are endowed with.
Yeah, so thanks, Hussein. So happy to answer that. So for me, truthful is the first thing you have to ask when you're talking about truthful is, what is the truth statement about? And if the truth statement is about objective reality, I would argue, do we have scientific experiments that can prove something as, you know, a certain way or another way, you know, either prove it true or false? And if we have scientific experiments that can prove something about objective reality, true or false, I would consider an accurate assessment as truthful. If we don't, then I would say it's a subjective truth. And then the truth value becomes the paradigm of the holder of the subjective truth. And, you know, basically I get to decide what my values are. And so if I say these are my values, it is my subjective truth. And so that's what I mean by truthful for subjective truths. So hopefully that defines truthful both in terms of objective truths and subjective truths, knowing that there's this big gray area in between. And like, you know, you kind of have to use your own judgment there, because I'm not going to give answers about like all of what is true and not true for every individual on earth tonight. Give me 2 days. No, I'm just kidding. So I'll never be able to do that. Like, we all have to decide for ourselves. So as far as happiness, I consider happiness a subjective truth. So I think each one of us defines how happy we are subjectively. And sometimes we may lie to ourselves, and ultimately we're the ones that suffer if we do. And I think that happiness is a subjective truth. And so we decide how happy we are at a given point in time. And in fact, if you go with Buddhism and Stoicism, it says that happiness is, you know, more or less fully within our control. I'm taking a little bit of liberty with Buddhism, but Stoicism full on says that, and says you should only focus your happiness on what's in your control for Stoicism, whereas Buddhists would say, don't be attached to anything, which I basically after long discussions with a Buddhist monk, have come to explain to people that what is meant by that, which I fully misunderstood when I first learned it, means just don't be disappointed by anything that happens. And I would argue if we're never disappointed by anything that happens, then we're never upset or unhappy. And so we only have either happiness or neutrality. And cool, like that's not exactly happiness, but it's close. And so Hussein, does that help you with defining those two terms? From my perspective, again, this is my perspective, and I'm letting everyone share their perspective as we go. So, you know, very open to other perspectives.
I appreciate the effort very, very much, Garrett. However, I do respectfully disagree with that entire definition. And if I were to give you my argument, I'm going to go down a pretty pedantic road and give you my own semantics. However, this is your presentation. It's your time to shine. So,
well, Hussein, I would love for you to reach out to me and we can have you present another night. I really like to have other presenters. So let's give you your own night to shine, and you know, you can present, you know, whatever you're interested in. You're clearly a well-informed guy with strong opinions, and I'd love for you to share your perspective with everybody. So feel free to reach out to me, and same with everybody. Anyone that wants to present, like, reach out to me. We can talk about what you want to present and, you know, what you want to share with the audience. And as long as there's some practical value add to people's lives, then I'm very open to that. That's really the goal of the organization, is to add practical value to people's lives. Remco.
Yeah, well done, Garrett. I'm a little bit daunted by your confidence and your thoroughness, but let me have a try at raising an issue here.
Sure.
What I get from your presentation, and it's ultimately aimed at religion, but I kept saying to myself, I think you mean faith. Because, you know, we're in the Western world. I think the majority of us here are in the Western world, and we're coming from an Abrahamic religion. There are other religions. And when you talk about the distinction of religion and science, you use objectivity versus subjectivity. I'm wondering whether it is not safer to say science versus faith, you know, where it's based on doctrine, credos, particularly in the West, you know, where it's based on books that are not to be challenged. Because, you know, in the end, I also have a problem with science. I mean, you spend a little time talking about relativity. Now, relativity, with a little trick of frames of reference, puts people in boxes. In a sense, there is, I would suggest, it's a world of subjectivity, because the world is defined from the perspective of the observer. There is no objective event. It is always relative. It is relative between two observers, and only two observers will agree on some. It can only agree on one thing. It becomes more accentuated at an event horizon. And at an event horizon on the edge of a black hole, you get a situation totally where one observer sees something else. And I actually read where Leonard Susskind, a very respected physicist, talked about saying, well, in the end, it seems like everything is relative. Everything is therefore subjective, not real. At the other end of science, and I'll conclude with that because I'm rambling on a bit here, you know, in quantum science or quantum physics, call it what you like, has got grand enigmas at their very heart. I mean, we're still struggling with the Copenhagen interpretation, the discipline of excluding the observer. We're dealing with the enigma of the double slit experiment, the quantum Zeno effect, entanglement, quantum erasers. They're all sort of issues which raise subjectivity. Yeah, what am I saying? Anyhow, I don't know whether I'm making a point here, but to come back, I'm wondering whether the issue actually is about faith versus science and being totally open, and that might give it, to me at least, a much more satisfactory discussion rather than, I'll conclude with that.
Thanks, Remco. I think that in 99.9% of interpretations, your assessment is correctly to state that it's a distinction between science versus faith. But I specifically the reason I say that is because almost everybody that believes in religion based on faith. But I would say spirituality adds a new dimension, and I would call myself a very spiritual person, but I'm very logic based, and I don't believe anything spiritually that I can't logically defend. But some of my beliefs are not scientifically defendable. They're only like logically defendable. Now, maybe by my definition of science, that's not really spirituality in terms of non-science. And so maybe I'm like hardcore in the science area, but some of my scientific beliefs are just not provable yet. All I would say though is, Remco, I think you're safe in assuming, and I would say that you're not going to be misled by anything that I said tonight by interpreting it the way that you said, which is science versus faith. I would just ask you to be open to the fact that some of us believe things that, science can't prove true, but we think is logically defendable, and right now falls into the realm of spirituality. And I will still, I guess I call those things spiritual. And so, I guess I don't think I'm giving you a very satisfactory answer other than to say, yes, you're right. And for the most part, you're right, but I think I could pick nits with it, but I really would be picking nits more than anything. I would just say, I would need to think more about it to give you a more well-defined answer. And I will also, just to opine on quantum science, I think that a lot of quantum mechanics doesn't make sense because determinists are interpreting quantum mechanics and not making sense of the idea that life could be, things could be random or even guided by free will. And I think that if we get into this other nights, like my perspective on free will and consciousness, like actually from my perspective, quantum mechanics makes perfect sense. And you did make the comment, Remco, about my self-confidence. I will say that I'm perfectly happy to be wrong about anything I say. And if you prove me wrong, I'm more than happy to agree with you if you can logically prove me wrong. I try to be very, my philosophy is one of like, as soon as you prove me wrong, I'm going to admit I'm wrong, and then I'm going to side with you, because as soon as I do, I'm immediately right again, except I'm more right than I was before. And I'm totally fine being more right than I was before. So I don't actually look at being wrong as a bad thing. A lot of us, and I really want to spread that message to more people, because I think a lot of us are so focused on our cognitive bias that we have to think that we're right about what we believe now. And I really wish more of us could sort of adopt this philosophy that being right about what we believe now is not the place where we grow. The place where we grow is about being loyal to truth. And when someone points out a new truth that is more likely to be true than the one we currently believe, just adopt it. And that's where I kind of mentioned earlier, the only time we're wrong is when it's clear we're wrong and we don't admit we're wrong. So I am very confident in a lot of the things I say because I can logically support them and I believe them, and I've subjected them to like hundreds of people's worth of scrutiny. Literally over 100 people, including a PhD who specializes in free will, read my paper on free will, and not one of them was able to shoot a hole in it that I couldn't solve, or patch up. And so I have a lot of confidence that it's right. Now, someone comes and proves me wrong, I would love to be a determinist again, because it would absolve me of all my responsibility, and that would be cool. But for now, I kind of have to believe that my logical inquiry and focus on wanting to be more loyal to truth rather than being right is leading me in the right direction. And that's what I want for, people who like that path, for us to help each other follow that path. And then the last thing I'll mention is that I have a paper on the double slit experiment that explains that. And I found recently a paper that sort of reaffirms this is, again, a situation where I came up with an interpretation of the double slit experiment that made it make sense to me. And then I found a PhD paper from like, I think it was the 90s or early aughts that supported my perspective. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me in the online community, Remco, which I'm going to post in the chat, by the way, because we're almost out of time. And I do want to post it before we leave. We use a software called Discord, which if people want to hang on a few minutes past 9, there are a few other questions and I want to answer those, but I'll give people a demo of the online community for anyone interested in staying in touch between events. I delight in this kind of intellectual discourse. So I really, would love to stay in touch with people throughout the week for those that are able to. Whoops. So
could I just come back there quickly?
Yeah,
look, I think, yes, there are lots of rationalizations, and I think it's an important point I want to make here. There are many rationalizations. To take one example only, and just the one, the double slit experiment. And David Bohm came up with the pilot wave theory, which is very plausible to some. There are all manner of things, but to avoid being a conspiracist, because if you're a conspiracist, you will take something and say, this, I've done my research, and you have to be open to a majority view, and even that is dangerous. And that is why I'm so confident and will hold my ground here, that the thing that distinguishes science from so-called religion is faith, and that is being blind and saying, well, I believe, and that is it, and that closes the door. And I think we you can send me that paper, but you still in the end have to go with the majority view. And so long as the double slit, to take one example, but it's a key. Time 100 had the most important experiment ever done. Leaves an enigma, and in that enigma there is something quite profound, and you could say an opening for religion. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to say there.
Well, I just want to thank you, Garrett, for having this meeting. Hope to see you next week.
Thanks. Have a good night, Jenny. So
Neville has his hand up.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Remco real quick, and then I'm gonna jump to Neville. So Remco, I did do a little bit of subconscious noodling, and I think that faith is actually a fair distinction between the two paradigms. The reason I say that, and I'm going to try to logically defend your own point, which is that science proves logically consistent things. In order to believe something that is logically inconsistent, you have to have faith that it's true. Because if you don't have faith that it's true when it's logically inconsistent, what's making you think it's true? So I think actually I can logically prove your point is right, that the distinction is one between science and faith. So I appreciate that comment, and I agree with you. I think that's actually a really great way of summarizing the distinction. I wanted to say something about double slit, but let me let Neville go.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a spanner in the works between Remco and Garrett here.
Yeah.
First, 2 points. One in Remco's direction. I think if you work in the area of religious studies, I do as a historian and a philosopher. I think definitions of faith again is very contentious.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think if you look at institutional definitions, particularly around legal questions in Australia, where there's a debate about the religious discrimination bill, which is a real mess, legally and ethically, a real mess. And, and I think that draws out the problem that the assumptions about what religious organizations say is faith is not necessarily what outside people think it is. And vice versa, in the reverse, people just, I think, use the term faith, and you've got to really clarify what it means. And that takes on a lot of what you responded to, Gareth.
Yeah.
Too. So the second thing, though, is to throw the spanner in terms of logic for you, because it's the thing that I research, and I'm not a logician, but I was a student of Graham Priest. not in logic, because that's not what I did, but I did the philosophy of history. I mean, the history of philosophy. I'd run that as well. But with Graham Priest taught me the history of philosophy, and thinking about it philosophically, not as a historian. I've also trained as a historian, to think about philosophy. So, and the thing that sort of, Graham Priest in some sense, is the end point of where I want to get to. And that is that you have three basic principles, and you've moved really from the principle of non-contradiction, and then that makes perfect sense to me. But there's also the principle of, I'll mention the third one for next, which is the principle of sufficient reason, which I think is also feeds into a lot what you do, and I agree with.
Yeah.
But the real problem is the principle of excluded middle, which Graham, really has in, ditheism, has really sort of taken apart, the ability to accept paradoxes where, in some sense, his direction is not so much around the principle of excluded middle, but it has some inferences there. But it's not just either or. This is what I'm saying. It's not either or. It is also both and. There's also neither, in a sense, as a sufficient reason. So this is the problem in terms of the dichotomy between religion and, religion, inverted commas, and science, inverted commas. In some sense, it depends on what people are saying. Again, I go back to semantics. Often, because the question is unclear, we don't know whether it's an either or, both and, or neither.
Yeah, I think great points, Neville, and I do want to agree with you that I think defining faith, and I'm going to come back to Hussein, who always reminds me when he comes to define everything, which I appreciate about Hussein. It is important, and it goes back to, ever since Wittgenstein, we got to be careful about our definitions, and I think that's really important and true, because if we're talking about different things, we're going to disagree with each other when we agree with each other, and vice versa. And I guess when I said faith, like when I think of faith, I think of faith in one's beliefs, and that's probably where I'll retrade and say that if we have faith in one's beliefs, maybe it's not retrading, but for me, faith is having faith in one's beliefs. First and foremost, that's the faith that I have, is faith that I'm going to trust myself to be honest and try to find truth and try to be the best version of myself. And so that's there are different things that people can have faith in, and we probably won't, faith could be a whole discussion for another night, but I want to let Herb go next, and we're going to try to close out, let Herb and Claudio go, and then we're going to call it a night, because we're a little bit after 9 and I normally sleep at 9. So
Unitarianism as an example.
You were breaking up, Herb. Could you start again?
Yeah. Unitarianism looks at faith as a verb rather than a noun. In other words, faith is an action, a process, not an object or a set of beliefs. And so it is what allows you to go on the way that you're choosing to go. The second thing I want to say is that that particular faith, and others as well, ethical culture, and then some that were in existence in the 1600s, believed in science and reason as important pillars of getting at the truth, and it just sees that there are a number of ways of getting at the truth, and those are necessary. And then you also have the things that can't be proven or are uncertain at that time, and you're responsible for that whole mix. But those are the sources that they draw on. So So every religion is different. It has its own culture, and its culture is usually a moving target. And that was true of Unitarianism as well. But in the 1600s or 1500s, when it originated, there were a lot of different groups who were in touch with each other in Europe who all believed that conscience was essential, that a person should be allowed to dissent even from their own group. So that they might be a Unitarian, and they might have had certain beliefs at that time, let's say dogma, not dogma, but credo, but they wouldn't enforce it on anyone. And a person could be an atheist and get up in front of the group and say, I'm an atheist, and here are my reasons. And when he sat down, he was still a Unitarian. They had a culture of doing that. And there were many as well. I'll mention one named Peter Tfisk, who was the person who kind of coordinated the all-European conversation about that, and he wrote it up into a 1,000-page book, about religion and what it needs to be. And they convinced the pilgrims who were in Amsterdam, or not Amsterdam, but in Holland at the time, who were coming to America, to not enforce their credos on their members, but allow them to dissent from them and still be members of the community.
Great, thanks, Herb. I think the ability to dissent and the free flow of ideas, as long as they're expressed without violent intentions, which there's laws against, even in free speech, is really important. So, it's great to hear those examples. Claudio, do you want to go next?
Yes, but I don't want to prevent you from getting a good night's sleep.
Don't worry, I always go to sleep a little bit late on Tuesdays, so I'm used to it.
Oh, very well then. Okay. I was thinking about your model again with those 2 points, 1 and 2. Let's say regarding metaphysical inquiries, should we first, let's say, parse or browse the scientific database for a hit? And if we don't get a hit, then we turn to spirituality or religion regarding metaphysical inquiries or questions. Like you mentioned, the Big Bang, what happened before, and stuff like that.
So I think that's a wise approach. That's kind of what I'm trying to propose as a good approach is, look for whether or not science has, first ask the question, is this a question science could answer? If the answer is yes, see whether or not science has answered it. If the answer is yes, then, and you believe that it's got a good answer, then all right, so there's your answer. Science has answered the question. If the answer to either one of those things is no, then ultimately I would say, trust your instincts, but listen to the wisdom that religions, spirituality, I'm a big believer, I'm an omnist, so I'm not religious. I believe all religions are, equally valid opportunities for people to learn wisdom. And I try to learn wisdom from all religions because, I logically can't conceive of why I would only believe wisdom from one religion when another religion also has really good wisdom. Why would I not believe the wisdom from both religions? And even if my own religion taught something that I thought was super unethical, why would I believe that if I thought it was super unethical? So ultimately, my path is to learn wisdom from all religions, which is, we should do another topic for religion another night. And so I would just say, trust your own instincts about what you think is right and wrong, but listen with an open mind to religious and spiritual guidance when science doesn't have a good answer. But ultimately, we are all ourselves, and who can you trust more in this world than yourself? And one thing that I really love about Buddhism is the Buddha himself, and I say the same thing, and I took it from the Buddha, and I like to say where I took my wisdom from. So I took this from the Buddha, and the Buddha himself said, don't believe anything I say, don't believe anything because it's written in your religious books or taught by religious leaders, including what I say, even because it's taught by me. You should believe it's true because you're convinced it's to be true of your own free will. And if you believe it's to be true, then you should adopt it. And that's why Buddhism has a lot of dissenting opinions. And people, Buddhism, teaches to be vegetarian, but there's lots of non-vegetarian Buddhists. You can be non-vegetarian and Buddhists will still accept you. they'll accept you for pretty much anything, to be, if you like Buddhism, want to be a part of it. It's a very accepting religion because its roots were in trusting the individual to make the right decision. And ultimately, I can't think of anyone better to trust, than individuals. I'm much more of a believer in trusting in individuals rather than authority. I would argue most of the times that unethical things were done in history, it was because people blindly followed unethical people who led people in an evil direction rather than a majority of people were truly unethical. Like, I think it's a very rare case that a majority of people were truly unethical. If anyone knows of an example where that happened, let me know. But Sarah, let me let you go last and then we'll kind of close out.
Okay, I wasn't going to talk about that. You just threw that question in there.
Okay.
That's not what I'm answering. I was just saying that it seems to me that people that are extremely religious are not threatened by science, and people that are extremely scientific are not threatened by religion. That from the people that I've known in my life, it's always been the same. When you are really stationed in it, you're not threatened by the other because they factor together, and people kind of see that. That was it.
Cool. So I want to kind of close things out, and just I'm going to give a quick demo of the online community, and then let me close this. A quick demo of the online. Actually, I first want to close things out, and then so that we can get the recording closed out. And then I want to thank Lois for her great moderation. So really appreciate her for volunteering. And I also want to just thank everybody for the really, really thoughtful comments, questions, discussion. Like I said in the beginning, like my favorite part of any conversation is the conversation and the questions. Those are, where a lot of the time the best insights come from. So I just want to thank everybody for participating and being a part of tonight, including those observers. And hopefully you got value out of this as well. And I want to encourage you to speak up, because I will say, like, if you have a question, probably there's like 3 other people that have the same question. So never hesitate to ask a question. It's always good to put yourself out there. I apologize, we never got into breakout groups. Like we ended a little bit later than I thought, and then we really didn't have enough time to do breakout groups, so I ended up not doing it. But I want to thank everybody for coming, yeah, I'm gonna do a quick demo. We'll close things out there for the recording, and then I'll do a quick demo of the online community. Just want to quickly run people through the software is called Discord, and so the way that it works is there are these channels on the left. And so you have the general channel, which is where people start out. And then you can introduce yourself in the introduce yourself channel where people have introduced themselves. And then these are the topics and voice chat. If you click on this, you'll enter the voice chat. And if you are in the middle of a conversation with someone else, to exit the voice chat, by the way, you click this little phone and an X button. And then if you're in the middle of like,
make it a little smaller. It's a little bit big. Half of it's off the screen.
Oh, is it? It must be like interesting. Is this better?
Pull it down and to the right. Yeah, there you go. Maybe a little smaller, and then you got it, but that's a lot better.
Okay. I think it depends on your monitor, but
a little bit more. Okay, that's good.
So, but basically, if you're chatting back and forth with someone and you want to voice chat, I especially recommend this if the conversation gets tense. Like, it's always better to voice chat and hear someone's tone of voice. You can say, hey, can we chat in voice chat? And you can jump in voice chat, and then you can talk via voice. You can also do video chat in Discord. You can do screen shares. Like, it's a very powerful software. It does take a little getting used to. So if you're a little frustrated by it the first few weeks, I would highly encourage you to stick with it. If you stick with it for a few weeks and you use it regularly, I bet you'll like it a lot. I didn't like it for my first few weeks, and I invent software for a living. So I will say there is a learning curve. If you have trouble registering, try doing a lost password, and try doing a lost password if you've validated your email, or re-registering again with the link. The link can also be found on freethinkerinstitute.org, which is our website. I think that's everything I wanted to cover. Anyone have questions or thoughts or anything like that? There will be a survey, by the way, coming out about how you like the event. And so I would love everybody's feedback. We'll also try to send a survey out. The reason we do the registration in the email is to get people's emails so we can send a survey out afterwards to get feedback. And we'll also send a survey out asking for topics that people want to talk about and, for future events. And we might end up adding people to a mailing list so that you can get invited to the events on a weekly basis. I haven't decided if we're going to do that or not. If people have opinions, let me know. But like, you can always like opt out of the mailing list if you don't want to be on it. It'll be just a Google group. And so that way it would just like these events would appear on your Tuesday nights by default rather than having to register each week on Meetup. So James.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to talk about myths for a second. I believe in myths.
Cool.
and I believe everyone else does also, regardless of whether they say they're in a religion or not. And some of these myths are things like if there is a Big Bang, or if in a Big Bang, or because now believe in a Big Bang, and because they believe in a Big Bang, they believe in determinism, and determinism obviates free will. So there is no free will. So the things like that are myths to me. And
right.
just like myths in religion. So I think we need to be, and I'm an atheist, and when I talk to other atheists, I see myths emerging in their speech. So it's like like the myth of the last Christian, the myth that the Christians are going to die out eventually because they don't have enough truth, things like that. They don't have enough objective truth. There's something that's not objective about them. So these myths that we carry around, whether we're religious or not, are part of the issue here. And I think if you just simply observe myths and you let you give permission for the myths to exist, because they may not be in your own mind necessarily, but that they're going to be there. So that you'll be able to function in this world of strange ideas a lot better. And one of the proofs of this, things like eugenics. Eugenics was a really important myth because people who believed in evolution let eugenics exist in the United States and Germany, and it became very important science. So what did it lead to? Lots of bad things. So yeah, the myths can be very, very, very evil, and but they're going to happen. And I think that's what we have to observe, is that the myths exist. The myths and myths can't be eliminated through logic or reason. They're just going to evolve out of correct science will give rise to mythical sciences.
So totally hear what you're saying. I hope that myths that are not actually true can, do die out over time if we become more loyal to truth and better at discerning fact from fiction. And so part of the reason I started the Free Thinker Institute is to create an organization where we can all sort of seek to be the best version of ourselves, seek truth without trying to be sole arbiters of objective truth, which I joke to people who tell me, you are absolutely wrong and I'm 100% certain of it. I'm like, all right, but are you sole arbiter of objective truth? Clearly not, right? Like, unless like we're all mistaken and we should all be worshiping you. So we all come with our own opinions, but can't we help each other seek truth together and learn to be the best version of ourselves and have an open mind and use our critical thinking skills better to better distinguish fact from fiction, the both types of fact and fiction that we talked about tonight, both types of truth that we talked about tonight. And if we can get better at that, I think the myths that are not true will die out and more truth will live on over time. Now, current studies say that fake news travels faster than real news. So we're not in that paradigm today because lies spread faster than truth. But that said, I'm hopeful for a world where truth spreads faster than lies and the lies die out. And I believe that ideas have a lifespan the same way that sentient beings do. And the ones that aren't good enough will eventually die if we're all diligent enough about only passing on ideas that are true. So that digression aside, Marissa, go ahead.
I'm sorry. My whole thing with the religion is that religion was based to create a society, to rule a society. These are our laws, these are our rules, this is how you will behave. You know, there's faith, but originally most religions were started as a way to control a society. And that's it.
So maybe Marissa, but I think it would be interesting to hear Neville's perspective on that. I used to think exactly what you do, Marissa, and then like as I've learned more, I guess I've kind of come to the conclusion that religion usually starts out as someone or a group of people trying to teach wisdom to others, and then what it turns into is a bunch of wolves in sheep's clothing trying to control others and using religion as a guise for controlling others. And it becomes what you say, Marissa, but I don't think it originates that way. But I would actually love Neville's perspective on that because he's more knowledgeable in this than I am.
So there's about Daniel's Paul, P-A-L-S, has written a book on 8 theories of religion. And there are other texts around, that, have different numbers in terms of how many theories of religion there are. And what Melissa has said is one theory of religion. As I think you've well demonstrated, it doesn't mean that you have to choose one theory over the other. One theory is right and all the rest are wrong. Each theory illuminates an understanding of this category that we call religion.
Great. So I don't know if Marissa, if you wanted to respond to that, and then Claudio, and then maybe we'll close out for the night if that's okay.
Thank you guys. I'm just trying to learn, and I'm growing. My whole concept comes from, I guess, just my experiences, because I grew up Jewish, and I still participate in the faith, and I'm more on the reform side, which is more not really lax on the rules, but like there's different concepts. The concept of, that it was meant to rule as a society, but there's, like to me, it's, why I don't stay kosher is because it was meant to keep people from getting sick. Yep. And that's, we don't need that as much now, so the rules of society have changed, and some religions have changed in those rules of society, but others have not.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Marissa, that's a great example of what we talked about tonight, with a specific example of like keeping kosher. If you look at, what religion was teaching at the time was, the answer to all paradigms, whereas now science has shown that shellfish and meat, pork is actually perfectly safe to eat these days. So maybe now it's okay for us to leave that religious belief behind and accept science's belief. And you've decided yes, and Orthodox Jews decide no. I'm not saying which one's right or wrong, but like I'm saying each one of us should decide where in that paradigm we need to end up. And that said, Claudio, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting how many theories are out there regarding how religions emerged, or the belief in God or the afterlife. Yeah, I agree with Neville. There's different theories. It all depends on which period you're in human evolution, right? Like some experts say that they arose from the dream state, visiting deceased loved ones, and then vice versa, new ones visiting them in their realm, right? Some say it's due to autobiographical memory, because the early hominids, for millions of years, they saw other people, their relatives dying, but they never considered that they would themselves die one day. That happened for a million years. And then finally they realized about their own deaths, so they started believing in the afterlife. They started burying people, their loved ones, burying goods with it, right? Others say it's different reasons. Could be an explanation of natural events or the fear of death. Many theories. Could be a combination of both, but like I said, it all depends the time periods, the cultures too. Geography is important, where you're born, right? Yeah, so I find that very interesting. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm gonna let Sarah go. I don't like to end the conversation. I just love these conversations. So we'll do Sarah last, and then I'll close out if that's okay. Because I do like wake up, ridiculously early, usually 4 or 5 in the morning, and that's when I woke up this morning. So I am starting to get a little tired.
Very sorry, just to piggyback on what he just said, I've always wondered if the beginning of religion had to do with us feeling the North and South Pole and the magnetic fields of the earth and interpreting that as God. Not saying, that's always what it is, but all the animals can feel it. When a dog turns in a circle to go to the bathroom, they're aligning with the poles. So it's like, we're able to feel it. And I'm wondering if that's the interpretation, but we don't have to talk about that. I think you should go to sleep.
Sorry, my daughter's coming to me. So I just want to thank everybody again for the really thoughtful comments, conversation, participation, and listening. For those that were listening, you clearly hung in there, so you were clearly paying attention, and even that is really important. I'd love to keep learning with all of you. That's, I believe that we're all on this path of personal development and growth. And if we can help each other, I have a saying, if we don't help each other, who's going to help us? And so let's help each other in that path and help each other be the best version of ourselves. And if we can do that, then we have new friends that are helping us be the best version of ourselves. And, we can help each other achieve new heights. So thank you everyone for joining. Hope you all have a great rest of your night. Hope to see you all next week. Please answer the survey. Honestly, honest feedback is what helps make things better. And would love to hear what you all are interested in talking about other weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.